What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Let's Talk MMA podcast. I hope you guys had a great holiday. And did you guys see that they want to do a UFC White House event? I thought it was a meme, but it turns out that the president, Trump, wants to put on a UFC event at the White House, and Dana is very interested. Him and Conor McGregor were talking about it. It's a crazy thing they're going to try to put together for next year. And it seems like somewhere around or even on the 4th of July of 2026 is when they want to do it. I'm not gonna lie, it does feel like a Family Guy episode, but it would be cool to see it, although it just doesn't seem real. Like having a UFC event at the White House on the lawn outside. Are they gonna build an arena? Because Dana doesn't like to have fights outside with no roof. So they might build an arena for it or something. And is that the thing that gets Conor to fight again? He essentially called out Michael Chandler, and here we go all over again with Chandler waiting for Conor. And John Jones also is back in the testing pool. I don't know who he wants to fight, but he says he's gonna keep his options open. And this is after Trump announced the UFC White House event. I don't even know what kind of card they could put together for that, but I'd imagine it would have to be stacked. That might be the biggest card in UFC history. There's going to be people who have never watched a UFC event. They're going to be watching that one just because it's at the White House. It's so wild to even think about that there's going to be a UFC event on the front lawn of the White House, and it's happening that quickly. Like, are we in a simulation? I never would have thought ever that the White House would be hosting a UFC event. The UFC wasn't even allowed in New York for so many years. Now, it wouldn't be a true White House event without an American champion. Well, okay, technically we do have Killer Harrison, but the division's not that great. It's actually the worst division in the UFC. On the men's side, who could be the next American champion before we get to that event? There's always been a lot of American champions, and now for like the first time ever, we don't even have one in the men's divisions. But who could the next one be? Honestly, man, I think Sean Brady has the best chance. I think he is the guy. If we look at heavyweight, the best American there is Curtis Blades, and he's not winning that title. For light heavyweights, Khalil Roundtree, he's the best American fighter there. Could he become champion? He has a better chance than Blades, but I don't think he beats Ankalaev. In the middleweight division, it's Sean Strickland, but after losing to Dricus twice, I don't think he becomes champ. Anthony Hernandez has a chance. He's very good. Welterweight, Sean Brady. Can he become champ? Absolutely, man. That's America's guy right there. Sean Brady. At lightweight, the best American fighter is Max Holloway. Justin Gaethje's the highest ranked, but Max beat him. At featherweight, the highest ranked is Brian Ortega, who is never winning that title. For bantamweight, if we're not counting Merab, who also holds the American flag sometimes, if we don't count Merab, then I guess O'Malley's the best American fighter there, or Corey Sandhagen. I don't think either are winning that belt. At flyweight, it could be Joshua Van, but he's from Myanmar, and he also doesn't seem to represent America either. Like, even the flag is not American. So it could be Brandon Royval. I think Sean Brady is the best American fighter. And do you know an interesting statistic? There are 5 Georgian fighters in the UFC, and 2 of them are champions. Isn't that crazy? There are a total of 5 Georgian fighters, and 2 of them are the best. One of them is the pound for pound #1 fighter in the world. The other one's arguably the greatest bantamweight of all time. You also have Giga Chikadze, Roman Dolidze, and Alexander Topuria. That is insane. And Alexander can go very far. I don't think Dolidze or Chikadze are going to go that far, but Alexander Topuria absolutely can. So are Georgian fighters the best UFC fighters? Wait, what's their population? They have 3.7 million people in their country. Only 3.7 million, and they have like 2 of the best fighters in the world. That is the equivalent of the state of Connecticut in the United States. Connecticut has 3.6 million people. The country of Georgia has 3.7 million. Now, to be fair, Ilia does fight out of Spain. That's where he trains at, so it is slightly different, but that is kind of crazy, man. But does that beat Dagestan? Dagestan is 3.2 million. So they beat Georgia in that. They also have they also had 2 champions. Islam was the lightweight champion. Ankalaev is also. Dagestan versus Georgia. Very interesting. Yoel Romero did say that Georgians beat Dagestanis in wrestling. Now it seems like they are the new rivalry in the UFC. There was Merab versus Umar where Merab won. Dolidze versus Imavov where Imavov won. And now Ilia wants to fight Islam. And these are the 2 best fighters in the world. There was the whole Dagestani versus Brazil thing where so many of them were fighting each other. And the Dagestanis won most of the time. And it seems like that rivalry has shifted to the Dagestanis versus Georgians as to currently which country is the best in the UFC. The UFC's on fire, and mostly because of one man, Ilia Topuria. Where it seemed like the sport was lacking in a lot of excitement, Ilia has just like spearheaded his career in front of everybody else's. He is like the focal point of the entertainment side of the UFC right now. Alongside Islam Makhachev, these 2 guys are seemingly in a 2-man race as to who is the best fighter in the UFC. and eventually that fight would have to happen, right? It would be a travesty if the UFC never has that fight, but it would need Islam to beat JDM, because if JDM beats Islam, it doesn't hit the same. These two guys have to be on the best win streaks when they fight each other. I know a lot of us throw around the term greatest a lot, but with no exaggeration, I believe Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria is the greatest fight in UFC history. They're the two most skilled fighters we've ever seen, arguably. I mean, there's like GSP and Khabib and Demetrius Johnson and fighters like that, but I would say at least it's the most skilled fight between two fighters we've ever seen. If Islam beats JDM, then it would be the first ever fight between two double champions. That has never happened before. Islam will have the longest win streak in UFC history, tied with Anderson Silva, versus the 3 best win streak in UFC history from Ilia Topuria. A combined 33 fight win streak is insane between two fighters, and they're fighting at the highest level. There's no fight greater than this one. Number 1 pound for pound versus number 2 pound for pound, and Islam's been part of that fight before. When he fought Alexander Volkanovski, who at the time was the number 1 ranked fighter, he beat him twice, and he also beat the number 3 pound for pound, Charles Oliveira. If he beats, again, the next number 1 ranked, Ilia Topuria, after winning a second belt against JDM, I mean, he might be the greatest fighter we've ever seen. Beating JDM and then Ilia, I think makes Islam the greatest fighter of all time. There'll be 4 top 3 pound for pound wins for him, which has never been done before. 2-way world champion, longest win streak in UFC history. That'd be like, what, 7 title wins? And the level of competition at that point would be insane. Charles, Volk twice, Dustin, JDM, and then Ilia? Forget about it, man. Islam's the greatest ever. But if Ilia beats Islam, could we say he's the greatest? I mean, that would indicate that he beats someone else first, right? Because as Islam's going to fight JDM, Ilia's going to fight somebody else. And hopefully that's Armin, and the Armin win is the next best win for his legacy. An Armin win is better than beating Paddy or Gaethje, because he's the number 1 contender and the next best guy. If he beats Paddy or if he beats Gaethje, it's not going to impact his legacy as much as if he beat Armin, right? Imagine Volk, Holloway, Oliveira, then Armin in a row. That hits way different than Paddy being at the end of that, or Gaethje being at the end of that. If he could beat Armin and then fights Islam after, beats him, let's say knocks out all these guys as the way he usually wins. I mean, some people will say he's the greatest of all time, but I can see it. The level of competition would eclipse every fighter. And honestly, at this point, man, all the legends and GOATs of the sport, their level of competition, it just doesn't really stack up the same way compared to guys like Ilia and Islam and various other fighters at the top, like Volkanovski too, and Alexander Pantoja, and even Dricus. If we look at all the GOATs of the divisions, like Anderson Silva, right? The best guys Anderson beat were Dan Henderson and Vitor in the middleweight division. Although amazing fighters at the time, it falls off a cliff after that. Who's the next best guy he beat? I guess Rich Franklin. He does have the Derek Brunson win though, when Brunson was essentially in his prime and Anderson was washed, and he still beat him, although a lot of people think Brunson should have won. Like, compare that to Dricus. Dricus beat Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, Sean Strickland twice. He also beat Derek Brunson, which is one of Anderson's best wins, crazy enough. And that hurts to say, as Anderson is one of my favorite fighters ever. He is the fighter that made me a fan of the sport. But I have to be honest, man, the guys that he beat just weren't that great, other than like 3. And those 3 do not even get close to the guys that Dricus beat. Not even close. Adesanya and Whittaker alone eclipses everybody Anderson's ever beat before. The one thing about Anderson though, he did go up to light heavyweight 3 times. All non-title fights. And you know the crazy thing about all 3 of Anderson's light heavyweight wins? James Irvin, Forrest Griffin, and Stephen Bonner all failed their drug tests. James Irvin tested positive for methadone and oxymorphone. Stephen Bonner tested positive for a boldenone metabolite. And as for Forrest Griffin, he tested positive for Xanax. He said he had a doctor's prescription for Xanax because he couldn't sleep the night before due to how nervous he was. Bro, that's how much fear Anderson put into his opponents, or at least a lot of them. Yeah, but if Dricus beats Hamza, I think he's the greatest middleweight of all time. And it just goes to show that the legends that had the belts for such a long time, they just didn't have the same level of competition to the fighters that we have now. I think a lot of the legends, the GOATs of the divisions, like Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo, Demetrius Johnson, and Dominic Cruz, and all these guys, right? I think finally, most of them are being surpassed. And it's based off of one thing: quality versus quantity. When those guys were champions, it was like in the beginning of their divisions. The level of competition was not the same back then. And how could it be? It was really early in those weight classes when they were sorting themselves out more. That's why guys like Patrick O'Tay and Tellis Latis got title shots against Anderson. And Demetrius Johnson fought Ray Borg and Wilson Hayes and John Moraga and those guys. It's because that's all who were there. Dricus is not going to be defending his title against guys like Tellis Latis, Patrick O'Tay, and Travis Lutter, you know. Alexander Pantoja is not going to be fighting guys like John Moraga, Ray Borg, Chris Carriasso, Wilson Hayes, and even guys like Tim Elliott. The division has way past the level of Tim Elliott to be fighting for a title. I would say though, there are 3 legends that competition still stacks up to today. Those are John Jones, GSP, and Jose Aldo. The fact that Volk surpassed Jose Aldo is an amazing feat because Aldo beat some very good fighters. Now the difference with Anderson Silva were his performances. He would have crazy knockouts and stuff. I think him as a fighter, just with his skills, not looking at his legacy, but just looking at his skills alone, Anderson can fight with the best of them of any era. He was that good. Now that's not to say that the legends are always going to be worse than the next generation. That is actually not true. We can see with the light heavyweight division. Jones and DC's era was better than today's. The fighters then were more skilled. And you can even see it with boxing for an example. The welterweight and middleweight divisions in the 80s are still regarded as some of the best boxers we've ever seen, with marvelous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, Roberto Duran. Even when you compare them to today's boxers, they still stack up 40 years later. The reason why right now you can't do that for most divisions in the UFC is because the UFC started 32 years ago. We are still in one of the early stages of the UFC. After like 70 years, it's not going to be as much of a difference between different eras. But right now, I mean, we're seeing styles and skills evolve in front of our eyes. That's how much better the fighters are getting. Even like 10 years ago, there were one-dimensional fighters fighting for titles. The calf kick alone was wreaking havoc across the sport. Like specific techniques alone are changing the game. Whereas in boxing, that rarely ever happens anymore, right? Because boxing's been around for over 100 years. And I guarantee it, like 70 years from now, Anderson Silva, Dominic Cruz, Demetrius Johnson, Jose Aldo, even George St. Pierre, these are all going to be looked at as the pioneers of the sport. Perhaps like the same way we look at Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis. Maybe even earlier than that, maybe we look at them like boxers look at John L. Sullivan or something, It's hard to imagine GSP would eventually be like greatly surpassed in skill at any point in the future, right? Because of how good he was. But I can imagine people thought the same thing about Joe Louis or Sugar Ray Robinson when they were fighting in their prime. Not to say that they're equivalent in skill or whatever it is. It's like a similar concept. Like GSP is the best we have. He is a lot of people's GOAT of the sport, the highest expression of skill in MMA. To see him eventually get surpassed in the future is very hard to imagine, up until it does, right? And I can imagine it was the same thing when Sugar Ray Robinson was the best of his sport, the pound for pound #1 boxer in the world. When he was in his prime, I can imagine people thought the same thing, like there's no way any boxer is ever going to be better than this guy. But it eventually will. Like fighters will get a lot better than GSP because Ilia says it all the time that he is the next generation. He is the guy who's evolving the sport. But there's going to be another player into this that's going to evolve the sport even past that. That is so interesting. That is so interesting in what that looks like. What is the next level after Ilia? Fighters are going to be so well-rounded that the techniques are going to be better than they've ever been before. And I was looking at other fighters' opinions of Ilia, like how good this guy is. Every fighter says, outside of his weight class, that want to fight against him, everybody else who's indirect of Ilia Topuria say he's like the best boxer they've ever seen in the sport. His mentality is different. It's like Muhammad Ali-like. I even heard Dana say that. I've heard Rampage Jackson say the same thing. Like the perception that Ilia gets out of former champions and legends of the sport is that of like high greatness. He is truly evolving the game, just like he said he was going to. There was always a narrative that boxing was like one of the most important aspects of MMA. Ilia is showing why that is. I mean, this guy hasn't even thrown a single body and head kick in his entire UFC career. He does have good calf kicks, he's a good wrestler, he has good jiu-jitsu, good top pressure and all of that, but his striking is mostly revolved around boxing. Mastering the boxing fundamentals, specifically for the sport of MMA, right? Because of course he would be boxing different in the sport of boxing compared to this one. And even against Charles, like you see Charles trying to take him to the ground, which worked very well against Chandler. Chandler's a good wrestler, he's big and strong there. Easily wrestled Chandler to the ground multiple times in their fight. When he tried the same move on Ilia Topuria, it got easily defended and he ended up with his back on the ground. When he tried to get on top, his purpose of that takedown was to get on top of Ilia, but he found himself on his back. Couldn't secure any of the submissions. He was going for the leg lock, which honestly doesn't work that well in MMA. These guys have to stop going for leg locks. Charles does it slightly different than others, where he's just trying to scramble his opponent and try to get something off of that. Not necessarily submitting him with the leg lock, but maybe trying to get a better position off of it and not letting his opponent to get away from him as he wants them on the ground. But even Ilia punched him in the face to get out of it. The best defense to a leg lock is ground and pound. We've seen so many fighters get KO'd because they were going for leg locks. Do you notice one of the best uses of attacking the legs off your back is how Brendan Moreno tripped out Davis and Figueiredo. I think it was in their last fight or the second last fight. Insane, they fought 4 times. But he like kicked out his legs, grabbed the heel, tripped him on the ground, and then stood up. He didn't attack the legs with a submission, but he attacked the legs in order to stand up. That's much better use of using leg locks and stuff like that. And this whole leg lock mistake is also reflected in street fights. As soon as ground and pound is added into a fight, leg locks lose their efficiency. And overall for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's just not looked at as the same effectiveness as it used to be. I think the sports avenue that it took, like even before with karate and boxing and all these different martial arts, whenever money got involved, it turned into sport, and that seems to represent the martial art, right? What you see in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournaments where guys are pulling guard and going for leg locks and stuff, not the most effective thing to do in a street fight, but then again, they're not always entirely supposed to be self-defense, right? The sports part of it is not supposed to be self-defense, right? Those are not the same things because you're not pulling guard in a self-defense situation. You're not throwing Imanari rolls in a street fighting situation, you know? I would say in a street fight that boxing and wrestling are the most important to learn in an unarmed scenario. In a street fight scenario, I would say boxing and wrestling are the most important to learn. Muay Thai can be excellent, but you want to stay grounded, fast, swift strikes to knock the other guy out, and wrestling so you don't get taken to the ground, as most street fights end up on the ground, and you can control that if you know wrestling. So you can keep the fight standing or even slam them on the concrete, knock them out with your boxing. Like, those are the two best things to learn. It doesn't even seem like just in street fighting, but also in MMA, which is very interesting because MMA is almost like a simulated street fight with a few rules, right? But for both scenarios, street fighting and MMA, a mix of boxing and wrestling usually seems to be the most effective. And speaking of wrestling, you guys see that Bo Nickal is taking part of Hulk Hogan's wrestling promotion? It's called Real American Freestyle, and apparently it's an unscripted freestyle and folk style promotion for wrestling matches. Does he not care to get better for MMA? The wrestling match is on August 30th, which means he's most likely shifted his focus on getting ready for that instead of improving his MMA skills. Near 2 months is a lot of time wasted by not focusing on getting better. It's possible that he can have his focus on both, but it doesn't seem like the most practical thing, especially coming off a loss like that. And it brings up the question about how hungry is he to be the best fighter possible. Most fighters who are highly competitive are going to be thinking about getting better in this sport, not something else. Especially when you're as new to MMA as Bo Nickal is. Does he not care to get better for MMA? And he just wants to return to wrestling? Because the wrestling match is on August 30th, and he's most likely shifted his focus on getting ready for that instead of improving his MMA skills. Near 2 months is a lot of time wasted by not focusing on getting better at his profession. But again, which is his profession? Is it a return to wrestling or is it an MMA? Because trying to do both, especially coming off a loss where his overall skills are lacking in a lot of areas, both in the striking and in the grappling, right? It's the same guy who couldn't take down Jamie Pickett without a low blow. Some of his wrestling efforts were defended against by Cody Brundage, who's only a decent enough wrestler. Returning to the sport where he's formed his skills hasn't been super impressive in MMA, and it doesn't seem like returning to that is going to be the thing that gets him better in MMA. It could be that he just doesn't care, or maybe RDR broke his mental with that loss. Because you'd expect any highly competitive athlete to be obsessed with getting a win back after losing that badly. I can't imagine any other fighter who has high aspirations in this sport to go do something else, shift their focus from winning their next fight, right? Even Sean O'Malley did some grappling matches after losing to Cheeto, but he truly didn't believe that he got beat by the better fighter. Bo Nickal can't use that same excuse as he got destroyed easily by a better fighter. But again, Bo maybe just doesn't care that much. He's probably getting paid good money to wrestle, which is great for him if that's the avenue he takes for his career, but if he returns to MMA, I am not confident for his next fight. Like, for an example, he talked a lot about Hamza, right? He said he was gonna beat Hamza, all that stuff. If Hamza lost in like his 4th UFC fight, I could not imagine he would go to wrestling or something like that. He did it against Jack Hermanson, but he was winning. He was undefeated. People believed he was the best in the world. Like, he was an inevitable champion. So of course, it was a very different scenario with Hamza. But if he actually lost the same way Bo Nickal did, let's say Li Jingliang TKO'd him with a knee to the body or something like that, I could not imagine someone like Hamza would be focusing on wrestling after that. No, he'd be getting better as an MMA fighter, and that will be his sole focus. Just like many other fighters in the sport who have lost, like Peyton Talbot. Peyton Talbot got out-wrestled by Raoni Barcelos for the first loss of his entire career, and he didn't focus on going into wrestling matches and stuff like that. No, he got better in the gym. He stayed in the gym, focused on MMA, and those improvements in his wrestling got him the win against Felipe Lima. Bo Nickal loses, and not because of his wrestling was inefficient. He lost because of a deficiency in his striking against Reiner de Ritter, and he goes to wrestle. It just doesn't seem like he has that hunger like a lot of other fighters had when they lost. When wrestlers transition to MMA, there's like a grace period where they have to unlearn a lot of bad habits, right? Chael Sonnen has talked about this before, because a lot of the techniques in wrestling are not good for MMA. They can get you submitted, ground and pound shots, all that sort of stuff, which are absent in that sport. So instead of unlearning a lot of those habits, Bo Nickal is going to return to wrestling and relearn the habits again, or strengthen those habits because he needs to win those wrestling matches. And probably he doesn't think that he can get better as an MMA fighter, so might as well just focus on wrestling or something now. I don't know, man. I want to see Bo Nickal get better, but now that he's focusing on wrestling, I have no confidence in him winning his next fight. And you guys see Tom Aspinall says he has a fight and he wants to fight 4 times in a year. With the state of the heavyweight division, how fast he wins, why not 4 fights in one night? I think he can get it done. I think he could beat 4 top contenders within a week, maybe not in a single day. It's great that the heavyweight division could finally move on from the plague that was the John Jones era of that division. And the UFC is also looking to sign Buchecha, who is one of the best heavyweight grapplers in the world. He was fighting at 1, he's 5-1 in MMA, and they're saying that the UFC wants to sign him. So that's another potential future opponent for Tom Aspinall, because man, that division is lacking big time. So he's probably going to be fighting Cyril Gane next, if I had to guess. He'll eventually fight Volkov. He'll eventually fight Almeida and Acosta. He'll beat all of them easily. Teixeira might be able to knock out Derek Lewis and then get one more win, knocking out, let's say, Curtis Blades or something, and get a title shot afterward. Is he the guy that could beat or at least fight with Tom Aspinall? Who knows, but I don't think anybody can. I don't think anybody currently at heavyweight could beat Tom Aspinall. And he's looking to do exactly what Pantoja's doing. Beat everybody in the division. And I think he can do it. Now the question is, how far away is he from becoming the greatest heavyweight of all time? With the whole quality versus quantity thing, he's never going to have the same quality of wins as Stipe had. It's not possible with all the current fighters at heavyweight, right? He's not going to be able to fight guys like Francis Ngannou unless Ngannou does return to the UFC. That would be very different. But most likely, he's not fighting guys like Francis Ngannou, Daniel Cormier, or Fabricio Verdum, all those guys in their prime, right? Fighters with that status. Gane and Volkov are good wins for a heavyweight, but it still doesn't stack up to the quality that Stipe had. So the only way Tom Aspinall is ever going to become the greatest heavyweight of all time is if he eclipses all of the stats that Stipe had. So 3 title defenses in a row, 4 overall are going to have to be eclipsed. Aspinall's going to need like 7 title defenses or something like that to be the GOAT. And if he fights 4 times a year, he can literally do that in less than 2 years. I cannot wait for the Tom Aspinall era. But let's go to the questions. We're going to start with Rad. Hi Weasel, thanks for the content. This is my favorite MMA channel by far. Thank you so much, man. I think John Silva matches up against all the top guys at featherweight. And do you think he might be another Ilia Topuria level fighter? Also, do you think some weight classes produce better fighters than the rest? Ilia's rise resembling Connor's got me thinking, how many great fighters come up at featherweight like Volk, Max, Aldo, Charles, Dustin, Zabit, if he stuck around? Thanks again. No problem, man. Thank you so much for the question. So John Silva versus the top 5 of the featherweight division. I would say he beats Arnold Allen, Yair Rodriguez, Diego Lopez, Movsar, loses to Max, and then beats Volk. But Max is not at featherweight anymore, so if we count in Brian Ortega, he would easily destroy Brian Ortega. And comparing him to Ilia Topuria, I wouldn't say he's as good as Ilia, but he's part of that new generation. A very good striker with great takedown defense and a powerful striker. So he does have some similarities in that sense where even the way he stands, like he's very grounded with a lot of strikes that he throws and he sits on his punches very well with amazing timing on his shots. So I would say yes, he's part of the new generation, which is the next level, and that's why I think he beats Volk. But he's not as good as Ilia specifically. And the only reason I think Max beats him is because of the durability if it's still there. If his chin didn't get destroyed by Ilia, and he has a 5-round cardio, very good striker, all of that. I don't know how good John Silva's cardio is, but I don't think he can keep up with Max's pace, and I think that's what wins Max the fight. And now your second question, do some weight classes produce better fighters than the rest? Yes. I believe historically, if you look at from the beginning of the UFC till now, the featherweight division has produced the best fighters overall. We could just represent the weight class with the champions, starting with Jose Aldo, right? Or even if we start with the WEC, with Uriah Faber and Mike Brown, you go to Jose Aldo, Conor McGregor, Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski, and Ilia Topuria. All of those fighters are elite. Every single one of them. Brown and Faber are definitely the worst out of those, but they were very good fighters for their era. And going from Aldo to Ilia, these are some of the most skilled fighters we've ever seen in the sport. And they're all from the same weight class, right? You can't say the same thing for every other division. Every other division had champions who weren't as good. In heavyweight, we had Andrei Arlovsky and Tim Sylvia. At light heavyweight, we had Jamal Hill. At middleweight, we had Michael Bisping. You know, no disrespect to Michael Bisping, but come on, you know, like that's not on the level of the featherweight champions. Every single one of those guys were great. At welterweight, we had Matt Serra at one point. Some will say now Leon Edwards. I still think Leon's a very good fighter, but I think now he's underrated. With how many people think he's not that good and he had flukish wins and stuff like that. I would say if he never beat Usman twice, then yes, that one win against Usman would have been a fluke, but the fact that he beat him again just shows that Leon's a great fighter, right? If you beat Usman, you're an elite fighter. And then in the lightweight division, at lightweight, they had Anthony Pettis, who was a good fighter, but not on the same level as those featherweights. In the bantamweight division, they had Sean O'Malley, right? And at flyweight, flyweight had actually all very very good champions. I would say flyweight has some of the best champions out of any other weight class too. So flyweight to featherweight, I would say have the best history of champions out of any weight class, but featherweight being the best out of them. There's been no other division with more successful fighters who moved up than the featherweight division. There's been so many featherweights who beat some of the best lightweights in the world when they moved up into that weight class. Max Holloway, Conor McGregor, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Dan Hooker, Ilia Topuria. That division has had the most success of fighters moving up than any other division. So excellent question, man. And then we have Sushan Tika. Why do you use Khabib as a backdrop in your prediction videos? Any specific reason? Well, it was originally Conor because the whole Mystic Mac thing. But when Khabib beat Conor, then I changed it to Khabib. So I kept it as Khabib until he loses, and he never lost. And during that time is when my channel grew a lot, and people just were familiar with my prediction videos with Khabib as a thumbnail. So I just kept it, even after he retired. I have changed it before with other fighters, but it's more of like an algorithm thing where I don't want people to skip over the video because I don't have Khabib on it, so that's why. So it's pretty much become like the thumbnail. Then your second question, who is that one fighter in each division who will represent the next generation of mixed martial artists just like Ilia did? I mean, I guess technically they're not the next generation, they are the current generation, right? And same goes to Ilia. Like, these guys are the current generation, which has just begun. In the heavyweight division is Tom Aspinall. And honestly, there's like nobody else who represents the evolution of the sport better than Tom for that division. Cyril Gane with his striking and footwork is definitely on the next level, but he doesn't have the grappling. And you need well-rounded fighters to represent the next generation. For the light heavyweight division, I would say it's Ankalaev. For the middleweight division, I would say Hamza, but he's not as well-rounded as I would say Imavov and Bohayo are. Hamza is more of an anomaly where most fighters are not going to fight like him. So he wouldn't be the best representative for the general fighter due to how unique his style is. And Dricus is one of a kind. There will never be anyone who fights like him and have success. Most who try to fight like Dricus would never get into the UFC. It only works for him, and I guess Reinier de Ridder somehow. So I would think Imavov and Bohayo represent the next generation better than even Hamza and Dricus, because those two are good at everything. They can wrestle, they can grapple, they have good cardio, they're technical, they're as well-rounded as it comes for a middleweight. For the welterweight division, I would say Sean Brady. At lightweight, it's Ilia. At featherweight, I would say John Silva, but I would say Arnold Allen, Lerone Murphy, and Yusuf Zalal are a better representative of what it is to be a well-rounded fighter, even more than Silva. So even though I think John Silva is the best fighter in that division, he's not necessarily as well-rounded, right? He's a striker who could defend takedowns. He doesn't necessarily wrestle offensively, go for submissions, or anything like that. Allen, Murphy, and Zalal will attack and defend in a well-rounded fashion. For bantamweight, I would say it's both Merab and Umar, but I guess Merab is not the next generation. Umar would be that. So for bantamweight, it's Umar. He's eventually going to be champion. And then for the flyweight division, it's interesting because Joshua Van is obviously the next generation, right? If he doesn't beat Pantoja, he's eventually going to be champion at some point in his career. But he's very similar to like a John Silva. He's a striker who will just defend takedowns. He's not going to wrestle offensively, go for submissions or anything like that. He's going to strike and try to knock you out. But I guess Ramazan Temirov is the most well-rounded of the next generation. So I think he represents it the best. And then for the women divisions, I would say because they are behind, so they don't have to be well-rounded. So I would say Norma Dumont. And then for flyweight is Jasmine Jasavicius. She's actually very good everywhere. And then for the strawweights, none of them. While there is no one in the rankings that stands out. Yeah, I don't know if strawweight is going to have like a next generation that surpasses Zhang Weili. The next era for strawweight might be even worse than the current era. Then your third question, do you think Ilia levels or breaks Islam's title defense in lightweight? No, not because he can't, but because I don't think he cares to. Ilia said a while ago that he's not going to be fighting for that long, and he's just there for the biggest fights, right? He wants to fight the biggest fighters. Now, that is just speculative. I don't really think he cares to do that, but if he does, like if that is a goal of his, then yes. Besides Islam and Arman, I think he beats everybody else easily, right? So if he fights Arman Tsarukyan in a close fight but beats him, then he knocks out Justin Gaethje, knocks out Paddy Pimblett, and submits Dan Hooker, then he leveled Islam's title defenses. And honestly, can you see him doing that? Do you think he beats Arman, Gaethje, Paddy, and Hooker? I think so. Besides Arman, all those other fights are easy for him. Keep up the good work, brother. Thank you so much for the questions, man. And then we go to Yoel Castro, greatest gatekeeper in every division of all time. Interesting question. At heavyweight, the ultimate gatekeeper at heavyweight, I would say is, if you're a champion, you can't necessarily be a gatekeeper, because I was going to say Andrei Arlovsky, but he was a champion before. You know what? Travis Brown. Travis Brown is the ultimate gatekeeper, right? And just to define it, making it easier, a gatekeeper is someone who's never been champion, never fought for the belt, and pretty much is the guy that if you beat them, then you become one of the best or like a top ranked fighter, right? And I think that will be Travis Brown for the heavyweight division. For light heavyweight, there's a few fighters, but I would say it's either Alexander Rakic or Ryan Bader. One of them two. Ryan Bader, the easiest fight in the weight class. Dude, that was the best DC moment of all time. I want the easiest fight. I want Ryan Bader. For middleweight, it's easily Derek Brunson. Brunson might be the best gatekeeper in UFC history. And so many fighters got title shots off beating him or fought other top contenders because they beat him. It's insane. The guy fought Yoel Romero, Robert Whittaker, Anderson Silva past his prime, Jacare, Adesanya, Cannonier, Dricus. The man's literally fought the best middleweights of all time and never fought for the belt. Now for welterweight, I would say it's probably Neil Magny or Jeff Neal. Neil Magny more because he's been there for so long. And it's crazy that Magny beat Jeff Neal. So yes, I would say Neil Magny is the gatekeeper of the welterweight division. For lightweight, it definitely was Donald Cerrone until he fought for a belt, but I would say it's Dan Hooker. 3 fighters got a title shot after beating him. Islam Makhachev, Michael Chandler, and Dustin Poirier. And Edson Barboza was 1 win away from fighting for a title after he beat Hooker too. So yeah, I would say Dan Hooker is the best gatekeeper in lightweight history. For featherweight, I would have said Josh Emmett, but he did fight for an interim title. Honestly, it might be Dan Ige. If you could beat Dan Ige, you're eventually going to make it to the top of the division, right? Kelvin Kattar made it to the top 5 after beating him. Korean Zombie fought for a title. Josh Emmett fought for an interim title. Movsar's in the top 5 and should be fighting for a title. Diego Lopez fought for a title, and Laurel Murphy's on his way up. So I would say Dan Ige, even though he's always been at the lower end of the rankings, I would say he's the best featherweight gatekeeper. Then for the bantamweight division, easily Rob Font. Then for the flyweight division, the best gatekeeper is probably Dustin Ortiz. Then for the women's bantamweight division, maybe it's Yana Santos. For the women's flyweight division, I would say Vivian Araújo. And then for strawweight, it's Tisha Pennington. But great question, man. They'll go to Felipe Araújo. Best fighters in each division that never fought for a UFC belt. With wins over Gane, Pavlovich, Overeem, and Verdum, I think Volkov should be on the list. For the heavyweight division, you could say it's Volkov, especially because he beat Pavlovich. The Gane fight, even though he should have won, Gane did get the decision. But it can't be Gane because Gane was an interim champion and he fought for the undisputed title. So, but even still, yeah, I would say it's Alexander Volkov. I can't think of any other heavyweight that's better than him who never fought for a title. And light heavyweight, it might be Carlos Ulberg. Technically, he hasn't fought for a title yet, and I can't think of another light heavyweight that's better than him who never fought for a belt. Maybe Ryan Bader, but I can see Ulberg beating him. So I would say Ulberg. At middleweight, it's Hamza Chimaev, but since he is fighting for the belt, I would say it's Gegard Mousasi, who was arguably the next title challenger if he didn't leave the UFC. At welterweight, I would say it's Sean Brady. At lightweight, it's Arman Tsarukyan. At featherweight, I would say Zabit Magomedsharipov. At bantamweight, easily Corey Sandhagen. And at flyweight, I think it was John Lineker, even though he made weight just as much as he missed weight for that division. But yeah, I would say John Lineker. At women's bantamweight, it's Norma Dumont. At women's flyweight, Natalia Silva. And at strawweight, Verna Jandiroba. Pretty much the top contenders of those weight classes, currently. They'll go to Devil's Crypt. During UFC 254, Khabib was set to fight Gaethje, and Islam Makhachev was originally scheduled to fight Rafa dos Anjos, but that fight got cancelled due to RDA testing positive for COVID. Khabib then publicly challenged Michael Chandler to step in and fight Makhachev, saying that if Chandler won, he'd get the next title shot. My question is, if Michael Chandler had accepted that challenge and ended up beating Islam Makhachev, do you think that could have changed the course of history, possibly even causing Khabib to delay or reconsider his retirement? Since Khabib was a man of his word, could Chandler's decision to not step in have actually played a role in Khabib retiring that night after beating Gaethje? Very interesting question. If Michael Chandler stepped up and actually beat Islam, I don't know if it would have been enough to keep Khabib in the game, but it would have put a lot of pressure on Khabib to do so. Now, yes, Khabib is a man of his word. He gave his mom his word that he would never fight again. So I don't think Khabib would have fought, but there might have been some regret there if he didn't fight Chandler in that scenario, right? Because how can you not fight the guy that you told him to step up and fight Islam, believing that Islam would beat him, and Chandler defeats Islam, calling Khabib out? Because you know for a fact that if Chandler defeated Islam, he would call out Khabib. He would cut a promo on the mic, call Khabib out, and make the fight as big as possible. And at that time, Chandler was in his prime. That was right after he beat Dan Hooker. Chandler started to fade off after the Charles Oliveira fight, right? Arguably, that was the last prime Michael Chandler, was in the first fight against Charles Oliveira. So instead of that fight ever happening, he stepped up to fight Islam Makhachev, beats him, cuts the promo on the mic, the UFC pressuring Khabib to throw all the money at him. I could see Khabib taking that fight. Perhaps not because of the money, but because he asked Chandler to step up, and Chandler beats Islam. Right? That would be the pressure right there. Now, of course, that would most likely never happen, right? I don't see Michael Chandler beating Islam Makhachev at all. Unless he did like a brain transfusion and gave him GSP's brain, then that would be different, right? If Chandler had like Volk's brain or GSP's brain, he might be the best fighter we've ever seen. But because he fights like Chandler, I don't think he would ever beat Islam. But in the scenario that he does, because any fighter can win, I would not be surprised if Khabib stuck around and fought Michael Chandler for his last fight. For Khabib and his own legacy, I don't think he would have stuck around. But for his friend, that would have been the best way Khabib would have taken one more fight, and he would have slaughtered Michael Chandler out there. I don't think he would have stuck around, but that would have been the scenario that could have got another fight out of him than anything else? Great question, man. Who has the best chances of beating Ilia Topuria from 145 to 170? So Ilia's not a big lightweight, which would mean he'd be very small for the welterweights. I think JDM would beat him. I think Bilal would beat him. I think Sean Brady would beat him. Shavkat. Would Leon beat Ilia? I think so. Usman right now, yes. I think his wrestling will be too strong. Usman's striking is definitely not as good as it was, but his wrestling is still very strong. And I think good enough to beat not only Ilia Topuria, but some of the other best welterweights too, as shown in his Buckley fight. I think Ian Gary wins, Michael Morales. Yeah, it just looks like the size of the welterweights would be too much. So I'll look at lightweight and down, including Islam. First, I would say Islam Makhachev. Then number 2, then I would say Dustin Poirier. And them two are far above the rest stylistically. Dustin is the only guy that can box with him and land some good shots on Ilia. Nobody else can, besides maybe, I guess, John Silva. I think John Silva has a decent chance of winning too, but I would say it goes Islam Makhachev, Dustin Poirier, John Silva, Arman Tsarukyan, Movsar Evloev, Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, Diego Lopez, Justin Gaethje, Arnold Allen, and then Yair Rodriguez. And no, I don't think Paddy has that much of a chance of beating Ilia. Even though that's like the hyped up fight, I think it would actually be one of the easiest fights in Ilia's career. Ilia would be landing home run shots on that chin until he's knocked out. He doesn't have the striking defense, he doesn't move his head, he's flat footed, he doesn't have the takedowns to get Ilia to the ground. Even if they are on the ground, Ilia will stand up eventually, just like he did against Charles. All Paddy has are the head kicks and a puncher's chance, and that's it. And that's not going to be as difficult for Ilia than even someone like Justin Gaethje, who can land leg kicks, who has better hands, faster with some of his strikes, and hits harder. I think Ilia Topuria would knock Paddy Pimblett out viciously in the first round, and the fight would not even be close up until that point. Styles make fights. Like, Paddy could beat Justin Gaethje, he could beat Dan Hooker and some of these other guys who don't have necessarily like great ground games, when he doesn't have that same advantage over Ilia. And I can't see Paddy outstriking Ilia other than landing some head kick, but Paddy just isn't as fast with the strikes, so I can see Ilia blocking the head kicks and using those to enter into the pocket with body shots and then going to the head with an overhand, KOing him. A lot of people talk about the size and power of Paddy Pimblett, but you don't beat guys on Ilia's level because you're just bigger than him. You have to also be highly skilled. Even when I was talking about the welterweights, that they're all bigger than him, they're all very skilled too. Like, they all have advantages, not just in attributes, but also in their skill sets, right? JDM can strike with Ilia the entire fight. He's one of the best strikers in the UFC too. He has great takedown defense, excellent switch striker with very good combination. Sean Brady can take him to the ground and has some of the best grappling in the UFC. Shavkat Rakhmonov, very well rounded, can take the fight to the ground. He has great offensive striking too. I think the hype of Ilia versus Paddy, because of the trash talk and all that stuff, is creating like a smokescreen on what that fight actually looks like. So that's my take on that fight. I don't think Paddy Pimblett gives Ilia Topuria much of a fight. But great question, man. Then what a goose said. Top fighters where a fighter lost his prime. For an example, Tony versus Justin, where deep down we knew it was the end. So Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje is definitely the first one most people think of. Renan Barão versus TJ Dillashaw is the other. Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw, which is crazy. TJ pretty much ended 2 fighters. Marlon Moraes versus Henry Cejudo. Moraes was never the same after the Cejudo fight, and it's crazy how good he was up until that fight, where he beat John Dodson, knocked Aljamain Sterling out in the first round, knocked out Jimmy Rivera in the first round, who at the time was one of the top contenders, avenged his loss to Hafala Sunsao in the first round. So 3 first-round finishes against top-notch bantamweights, goes into the Cejudo fight, wins the first round, beating Cejudo's legs up. Cejudo adjusts to the fight, switches up the game plan, and broke Marlon Moraes' will, to the point where he was never the same after. Vitor Belfort versus Chris Weidman, not because Chris Weidman won, but that was the end of TRT for Vitor, which changed them forever. TRT was allowed, right? But it shouldn't have been. And to be fair to Vitor, when they stopped allowing TRT, he got off of it, fought for the title, lost to Chris Weidman, was obviously not on the gear anymore. You can see how his body deflated, and then just got knocked out multiple times in his next several fights. Crazy. Luke Rockhold versus Michael Bisping. Luke Rockhold was never the same after he lost to Michael Bisping, which is crazy to think about, that Bisping was the guy who cracked Luke Rockhold's chin, because the fight after that he fought David Branch, and he also got hurt by David Branch, who wasn't a big puncher. Then Romero knocked him out. Then Blachowicz knocked him out. Then him and Paulo Costa had a war. And Rockhold's chin was a lot better before that. Even when Vitor spinning heel kicked him, he got dropped but not KO'd from that shot. Rockhold after the Bisping fight would have been KO'd from that shot. But when he actually fought Vitor, it was a ground and pound after that knocked him out. He was still somewhat conscious after taking a spinning heel kick to the face, which is impressive for Luke Rockhold. Another one was Chuck Liddell when he fought Rampage Jackson. When Rampage knocked him out, Chuck Liddell was never the same. He lost to the Dean of Mean, Keith Jardine, in his next fight. Do you know how insane that is? For Chuck Liddell, going from his prime, beating Randy Couture twice, Tito Ortiz, to losing to Keith Jardine. Then he had the fight with Vanderlei Silva, which was an excellent fight. Then went on a 4-fight loss streak, all knockouts. Rashad, Shogun, Franklin, and then much later Tito Ortiz all knocked him out. And the thing was, Chuck Liddell's defense was all about his chin. He used to eat punches like Tic Tacs until Rampage landed that right hook to the chin and KO'd him. Chuck Liddell just could not beat Rampage Jackson. He got finished by him in Pride, and then finished again in the UFC. Then we're going to Prince Malcolm. Thoughts on Ben Askren Insurance wanting to 10-7 him and refusing to help cover his medical expenses. Thanks, Weasel. Love the content. No problem, man. Thank you so much. And so Ben Askren did get the double lung transplant, but the guy has insurance, right? So why isn't it helping the most crucial medical procedure of his life? I don't understand that. Is it the medical system? Did he not have the proper health insurance for the procedure? But then again, shouldn't his health insurance cover that in general? I don't understand the health insurance and how it's structured, but there's something definitely wrong if Ben Askren's medical insurance is not covering his lung transplant. Then we go to Isaac Bedar Veterad. Which fighters had or have the best fighting style for outside the cage? And Islam vs Topuria early prediction. So who has the best fighting style for essentially a street fight? Ilia Topuria. He has the most effective fighting style on the streets. You can't take him to the ground. Most of the time guys are throwing hands. You don't want to be throwing hands with Ilia. How do you fight this guy, right? You throw a kick, you get knocked off balance. You don't want to be on your back in a street fight. And it's crazy that the best street fighting style in the UFC is also the #1 ranked fighter in the world in the sport. With other fighters, Dustin Poirier is another one. Rampage Jackson, imagine getting slammed on concrete. Fedor Emelianenko. A lot of fighters with that general style, where it's focused a lot on boxing and fast hands, good takedown defense, and strong offensive wrestling if they need to use it. Those are going to be the best fighting styles for street fights. In Islam vs Topuria, I think Islam wins. I think his wrestling would be the difference maker in that fight. He has good counter striking, good high kicks, decently fast strikes, and good footwork too. He was able to cut a few angles on Dustin Poirier to land his combinations, and he's also very good in the clinch. Even mixes in his combos with the Thai plum. Islam's striking was at his best when he fought Dustin. I think a lot of that stuff could also work against Ilia. But I don't think he dominates. I don't think it's a one-sided fight. I think it's very close where both fighters can win, but I think Islam has a slight advantage against Ilia. If Ilia gets into his range, the only thing I can see Islam countering with is the clinch, but he would have to grab onto that very quickly because Ilia's going to be ripping shots to the body and try to knock him out. I don't think Islam's going to have the most success if Ilia's pressuring him. Islam will have to be the one pressuring Ilia, and that's probably the best way for everybody to fight Ilia. They have to pressure him. He can fight on the back foot, but he's not as good. Like, he was countering Josh Emmett on the back foot with very good technique, but it caused him to constantly explode. And can he do the same when the other guy's wrestling with his pressure? That's why I think Khabib is a worse matchup for Ilia than Islam is. And speaking of that fight, we go to Trey J. Sosway. What would Ilia Topuria versus Khabib Nurmagomedov be like? I need a full breakdown, no bias, please. Again, I can see both guys winning, but I think the pressure with the wrestling could be a kryptonite for Ilia. We don't know though. We haven't really seen him go up against a fighter like that. And Khabib is the best fighter at that. I can't see the counter punching that he did against Josh Emmett being as effective against Khabib, who's diving at his legs and is a constantly chain wrestle. The first or second takedowns most likely are not going to land, but could he defend the third and fourth takedowns? And at some point, would Ilia gas out by constantly exploding for counter shots and defending the chain wrestling of Khabib? Khabib also has very good reflexes in the striking. Where he lacks the technique to get away from shots, he does have good reflexes to get his head away from those punches. Now, if Khabib is not able to pressure Ilia, I think Ilia knocks him out. And that's the thing about Khabib. We have seen fights before where he was not the one pressuring at the beginning of the fight, where he was the one moving away, like against Al Iaquinta. In the first round against Iaquinta was the one pressuring Khabib. Conor did the same thing in the first round before the first takedown. Ilia has something there that he can work with. If he could be the assertive one in there and pressure Khabib back, I think he wins the fight. But again, it's hard to say because Ilia's never fought a style like that. Until he fights someone like Arman Tsarukyan, we just don't know if that pressure wrestling style would be effective against him. Like, if Arman's very successful against Ilia, there could be some correlation with Khabib's style being even more difficult for Ilia to fight against. But if he defends Arman's takedowns and easily defeats him, I might lean to Ilia beating Khabib. Then again, it is MMA math, but it's pretty much the only thing we can go off on because Arman is the closest we have to Khabib currently in that lightweight division. So my answer is, I don't know if he beats Khabib, but I think he would be at least more difficult than Islam Makhachev would be. If I have to pick, I just think that chain wrestling style is so strong in the octagon, especially because of the fence. I would have to go with Khabib. And then go to Robert Sterling. Hey, Weasel, longtime fan. I'm 27 with no martial arts experience and currently in moderate shape. Definitely could improve. I've been thinking about taking an MMA fight by the time I turn 30. I already have a career, so this would just be something I'm doing for fun and personal challenge. Is that realistic or just wishful thinking? If it's just an amateur fight, yeah. And the coach will try to match you up with someone who's on a relative skill level. Now, of course, you're going to need a hard spar and be mindful of your sparring so you don't get injured or take too many hits to the head and stuff like that. There are some guys who don't control their power in sparring and they throw 100%. So picking your sparring partners is very, very important. You're most likely not going to spar for a while, but when you do, it's very important on picking guys who can control their power. And it's usually guys who have been training for a long time. So generally, those are going to be the best guys to spar with. And then we're going to Intent Chief. What do you think the big MSG feature prelim should be? UFC likes to use this fight as a platform to build a star. Last year, McGee won, and now he's fighting Jan next, which is crazy. I asked this last year and you said Bo. Thanks for the question. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, man. And they did have Bo Nickal on the MSG card last time, but he was the opener of the main card instead of the featured prelim. But I would say the next good star to build up for the next MSG card would be, honestly, there's 3 fighters I would think to put there. They could put Peyton Talbot there. Now he's coming off a win against Felipe Lima. The next MSG card in November most likely would be excellent for Peyton Talbot to get his next fight. There is also Lonnie Kavanaugh, but I doubt they would have Kavanaugh as a featured prelim fight, mainly because most people don't care for flyweights. Hopefully that changes after the Brendan Royval and Joshua Van fight, and that most flyweight fights are very exciting, but I don't think the UFC would put Kavanaugh in their feature prelim fight. The more marketable fighter would be Zhang Mingyang. He's a light heavyweight, knockout artist, Chinese fighter if the UFC is still wanted to expand their empire over there. He could be the best next star for them to build up on the MSG feature prelim fight. So I would say for the sport, I would put Lonnie Kavanaugh there. For the business side, I would put Zhang Mingyang. And then we're going to Hawk Rock. Why does John Jones get a pass and is widely regarded as the GOAT when he's been caught popping multiple times? But any other athlete in any other sport gets seemingly shadow banned from the sport when they get caught. And do what's even crazier about that? In this sport of MMA, doing steroids is even more dangerous than most other sports, right? Taking steroids in baseball is not nearly as dangerous to the athletes. Let's say, for an example, a roided, fueled John Jones could smash his opponent with ground and pound and change them permanently. And then we look at baseball, they're trying to hit a ball out of the arena, or in basketball, they're trying to shoot the ball into the basket. It's very different. But in those sports, if they do steroids, they don't get regarded as the GOAT. But in this sport, they would actually move the fight to a different state. Just for the guy who tested positive for steroids could fight under another commission. The standard is not the same for MMA with the other sports. And the thing is, John Jones didn't test positive once. John Jones tested positive 3 times, and that's not including the cocaine. And crazy enough, 2 of those were against Daniel Cormier. And the other one, Alexander Gustafsson. Both those guys were his rivals. So in 2015, when he fought Daniel Cormier the first time, he tested positive for cocaine metabolites. So in July of 2016, for UFC 200, which is one of the biggest UFC events of all time, Jones tested positive for clomiphene and letrozole. They boost testosterone and suppress estrogen. USADA later said that it was a contaminated supplement, so Jones only had a 1-year suspension. Then he gets scheduled to fight Daniel Cormier again, a few months after his suspension was up, and tested positive for Turinabol, which is an anabolic steroid. That win became a no contest. He was stripped of his title and had a 15-month suspension. A month after that suspension was up, he went up against Alexander Gustafsson and yet again tested positive for Turinabol. And that was the whole pulsing effect and moved the fight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles because it was a different commission. For any other sport, a fighter who failed 3 times would never be looked at as the greatest of their sport, ever. Why isn't Barry Bonds considered the greatest baseball player of all time? John Jones is essentially the Barry Bonds of MMA, where John Jones is considered the GOAT, but Barry Bonds isn't for baseball. Because statistically, the skill, and as just a player, Barry Bonds is the best baseball player that's ever existed. He has the most home runs in history, the most MVP awards than any baseball player, even including Babe Ruth and all the other greats. The only reason Barry Bonds is not considered the GOAT was because of the steroids. So now everybody says it's Babe Ruth, it's Willie Mays, it's Hank Aaron. Nobody even mentions Barry Bonds unless with an asterisk. And I think the same thing should be with John Jones. We can say Jones is the best fighter we've ever seen in the octagon, but we can't say he's the greatest of all time. In my opinion, the greatest of all time is George St. Pierre. Why is the standard for MMA that low that we can consider Jones the GOAT but not other cheats from other sports as GOATs? Right? Why do we have such a low standard for this sport? Appreciate the skills that he brings to the octagon and how good of a fighter he was, but to be the greatest fighter of all time, which is a representative of the sport, the GOATs of the sport are who represents those sports. When casual fans think of sports, the first question they ask is, who is the greatest? When people think about basketball, who's the first guy they think of? Michael Jordan. When I think of football, I think of Messi. I think of Cristiano Ronaldo. I think of Maradona. When I think of the sport of track and field, I think of Usain Bolt, right? I'm a casual fan of a lot of these different sports, and I can imagine it's the same way casual fans look at MMA. When they think of MMA, who is the first fighter they think of? Maybe for this sport, it's Conor McGregor because he's the most famous, but they also think of Jon Jones because of how the UFC promoted him as the GOAT. And I don't think it's the best thing, not only for the sport, but for the UFC specifically. Because once these casual fans start to understand that Jon Jones tested positive in multiple fights, it changes the whole dynamic. And now they start to think like, why are they promoting him as the GOAT when he did steroids multiple times, right? So that's why I think some of these other legends should be the face of MMA. I think GSP. There's nobody else better to represent this sport than Georges St. Pierre. So excellent question, man. Then we're to Charlie Russo. If Max Holloway had a normal reach for his size, could he become the featherweight GOAT? If not, what reach would he have needed? Or was the problem something else? Yeah, it was something else. If you gave Max Holloway a longer reach, he would have fought differently. I think the main thing about Max Holloway was that he wasn't as powerful. He didn't have the same punching power as some of the other featherweights, but when you give certain skills to fighters, you also take away some of the stuff that they already work with. So by giving Max Holloway a longer reach, I think he would strike differently, right? He wouldn't be the same fighter that he is. Or if you gave like Ilia Topuria a longer reach, he probably would not be the same fighter in the pocket. He would be throwing a lot more jabs and straights from long distance, perhaps similar to the way that Volkanovski does, right? Because Volk has a long reach, so those jabs are emphasized in his style. He has some of the best jabs we've ever seen, and it's usually the same for a lot of fighters who have a long reach. Their jabs and straights tend to be a lot more focused on, if not just better. Now, Max does have a good jab, and he has a short reach, but he uses it very differently. He uses it to set up his combinations, and it's different than some of the other best jabs in the UFC, like GSP, Gegard Mousasi, Kamaru Usman, Alexander Volkanovski. A lot of those fighters throw jabs in single numbers, not to set up combinations as much, but almost like pot shotting with that jab. Max could do the same thing, but he uses a lot more to set up his combos, right? He uses it to get in closer range, so then he can volume punch. So I wouldn't say there's anything you can give to Max Holloway that wouldn't take away from his style. Perhaps as the punching power, but even at that, he would probably fight differently if he had that like Ilia type of power, or if you gave him better wrestling or something like that. Right? A lot of those things would make him a better fighter, I would say, but it would change how he normally fights. So the only way I could see Max Holloway being the featherweight GOAT, which would mean he would beat Volkanovski in those 3 fights, I think the only thing is if you gave him more punching power. Then he could specifically beat Volk, because Volk didn't have the best chin, and he tends to get hit when he's retreating away from his opponent. So that would be the best addition to Max Holloway. So that's the end of the episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to give the video a like, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Excellent questions, and the next episode is going to be next week. And if you guys have any questions, it's going to be in the community tab. Leave your questions there, and I'll see you guys in the next video.